Great. So welcome again to our July briefing, and we are very excited to have with us today Krissy Lunz Trujillo. She is a postdoc at Harvard's COVID States Project, and she studies how rural identities shape people's beliefs and particularly shape their attitudes around scientific expertise and sort of institutional authorities, and is going to share with us today kind of her understanding around why we do see more skepticism among rural people toward institutional authority and scientific expertise. So Krissy, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone for also coming to hear me talk. I'm just gonna share my screen here. And you all see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Good, all right. So as you know, my name's Krissy Lunz Trujillo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard and Northeastern on the COVID States Project. I got my PhD in political science last year at the University of Minnesota while teaching at Carleton College. And I grew up on a farm in rural Minnesota, a corn and soybean farm, and that has shaped a lot of my research interests and what I study. Today I'm going to be talking to you about rural identity and anti-intellectualism, which is just a way of saying distrust in scientific experts and intellectuals. And so with that, I will get started. So there are some fairly consistent urban-rural differences in science and health attitudes, and that's been the case not just during the pandemic, but beforehand as well. But the pandemic has given us a pretty stark example of this. And so this is just one instance of many, but this figure that you see here comes from the Kaiser Family Foundation. It was a study done of American adults in November 2021. And this is polling parents and their likelihood of vaccinating their kids against COVID-19. And then it's split apart, not just by the ages of the children, but also by rural, suburban, and urban. And as you can see in both parental age groups here, if you just look at the urban parents, you have around 70% saying that being infected by COVID-19 is a bigger risk. It's more problematic than getting the COVID vaccine, all right? But then you can see if we look at the rural parents in both categories, that flips where you have majorities saying that, well, no, getting the vaccine's a bigger risk than getting infected with COVID-19. And so that goes against scientific consensus at current standing, where there's evidence to suggest the vaccine, while there may be sometimes adverse effects, that getting COVID is more harmful. And so as I noted, this type of skepticism, scientific skepticism, tends to be stronger in rural areas, even pre-COVID. And why is this the case? So some of the big reasons have to do with demographic differences in rural areas. And so the big ones are religion, politics, and then class as well. And so religion, we know that people who are more religious or that follow certain types of religion, such as evangelical Christianity, they tend to be more skeptical towards science and scientific consensus. And then that's also tied to political affiliation. So especially since the 1980s, when Republicans began to focus efforts and target the Christian right, those sort of political and religious tendencies overlap, and that tracks along the urban-rural continuum. You also have differences in class. So we know that people who have a college degree tend to be less skeptical of science. And so that's also a case where the demographic features across the urban-rural divide might be contributing to this scientific skepticism. And then this also, more specifically, this also reflects differences in worldview and values that are tied to place, because religion and politics and so on in our education, that's going to impact what we value. However, I bring in another element to this. And I argue that the nature of development and new information discovery when it comes to things like scientific expertise, or when it comes to things that are more intellectual pursuits, tends to be concentrated in urban areas. That's just where institutions of academia and other research tend to be located. And so that's been the case for a while. And so you have this legacy of outside experts from cities coming in, finding advancements in certain areas, and then imposing or giving ideas, practices, or policies that are perceived to be imposed onto rural areas. All right. And in doing so, that sort of discounts any knowledge that or opinions that local residents might have. All right, they might have, say, first-hand knowledge of something related to these new ideas and practices, but that's then discounted as ignorant or incorrect or backwards, and then it will build resentment. So let me give you an example of this. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, in places that were dependent on agriculture, which were a lot of places at that time period, a lot of universities created extension agencies. And so extension agencies were meant to be liaisons between scientific advancement and research, especially in things like agriculture or animal husbandry, etc. These agents would go out into the farming communities or rural communities and say, okay, here's a new way to increase your crop yield or something like that. All right, so that was good in that a lot of people who are working in agriculture in rural areas would adopt some of those practices, and they would, improve their yields or whatever else they're looking to improve. But at the same token, a lot of people were also turned off by that, because there are these outsiders coming in, these outside experts coming in, telling them how essentially to do their jobs, which, for a farmer, for example, that's not just their job, it's their sort of way of life and their identity. And so they're essentially telling them what they've been doing for 20, 30 years. And so that's just one example of it building resentment. It's this perception that they're being told what to do. And so that, that creates, that second part, creates some distrust of scientific experts and intellectuals. And so I also distinguish between scientific experts and some expertise that might be like experiential or something like that. And I call this anti-intellectualism. Right? And so this distrust leads many people to be skeptical of scientific consensus. It makes them less likely to follow health guidelines and be more likely to believe misinformation because of who is telling them that information is perceived to be coming from outsiders who aren't valuing their opinion or their experience. And there's a laundry list of how this impacts society, anti-intellectualism, not just in rural areas, but generally. It can impact negatively our ability to deal with climate change or environmental issues and pollution, which a lot of times that disproportionately affects rural areas. Impacts policy understanding of medical issues. Again, rural areas oftentimes lag behind on markers of health. It impacts any policy that can benefit from expert input, which is most of them. It impacts funding for scientific endeavors and advancement and so on. Okay. Anti-intellectualism is also strongly tied to political attitudes, in that a lot of these are policy preferences that might cause someone to vote a certain way. And so it really impacts political beliefs in the public and also among elected officials. Okay. In the example I gave before, I noted that not all, I said, in the example that farmers, some of them might, actually say, oh yeah, I think this would help. And so I want to sort of make that a broader statement. Not all rural residents are going to be anti-intellectual or distrustful of these experts. And so I argue that people's identity is further going to factor in here. In that, people who feel more tied to being from the country, who feel that being rural or being from a rural area is really part of who they are as a person, are going to be predisposed to be more distrustful of these scientific experts and intellectuals. And that's because, first of all, because you have someone might have that core sort of identity, they're going to be more focused on who's going to be perceived as an outsider. This comes from theory from social psychology called social identity theory. Intellectuals and experts are seen as a clear marker of otherness, and also alongside that sort of legacy of outsiders then looking down on us. And then the added psychological component is going to further make that distrust cemented, as there's more at stake mentally. Then also, sort of tying back to some of the other reasons why rural areas might be more anti-intellectual as a tendency, rural identity and rurality in terms of norms and values that the group might have also is tied to conservatism, and that's conservatism religiously, politically, and in terms of just being generally open to changes. These are all tend to be orientations against experts. And so this sort of rural identity, I argue in my research and in some extent elsewhere, this rural identity is going to be, first of all, higher among rural residents, but it can actually extend to non-rural residents who might feel that they are psychologically tied to rural areas. That's going to be linked to anti-intellectualism. And I found that to be the case nationally through experimental and survey evidence of American adults. And I found that those who are more strongly identified with rural areas are higher in anti-intellectualism scores. And I find this to be the case both among Democrats and Republicans. So that links, you know, it's might be a tendency more on one side or the other, but it's still largely present no matter what political affiliation you are. So I talked about this a little bit. Why would this matter? Rural identifiers are going to be less trustful of who they would call so-called experts. They're going to be more trustful of things like common sense or experiential knowledge, wisdom of regular people, etc. It also means that if these experts are promoting something, the tendency might be to go against it. Right? That involves a lot of the topics I previously discussed. It also indicates a greater susceptibility to support outsider political candidates because of how the political system is. Expertise is often linked to political power. It also increases susceptibility to conspiracy theories and misinformation adoption. So now that we have that knowledge, how can we use it to overcome such divisions or to try to help people when scientific consensus might be, you know, helpful to health or something like that? Well, first, it's hard, especially if it involves identity, because it's very core to people's sense of self. And it involves trust in groups that might have, you know, been eroded. And so that's really deep-seated. There's a lot emotionally and psychologically at play. However, I have a few suggestions. So first is that specific individuals or experts should work to build trust in rural areas and among those who are high in anti-intellectualism. So things like trying to be a presence in the community, trying to understand the community, trying to understand what people's concerns are, and just generally be empathetic in sort of a case-by-case basis, if it's just an individual expert or, like, say, a group. That's one way. Another is to change the messengers to trusted sources and not focus so much on that distrusted experts as the authorities. So one example of this was farmers turning their farms into vaccine clinics, because you have messengers that are, you know, the trusted sources in the community, people that might be known in the community. That's one example of this, where you have messengers or people acting that aren't the experts themselves. They're other known sources that are more trusted. Another is to use reasoning that might involve common sense or practicality or other sorts of values. And so an example of this would be something like initiatives for, say, wind energy, which is something that's where I'm from, that's a really big issue. So rather than saying, well, if we move to wind energy, we can decrease the amount of the reliance on fossil fuels, you know, which will help the environment, etc. Instead, make an argument of, well, if we build this wind farm, that'll cheapen the cost of energy, that will bring more jobs in. So it has that more immediate practicality rather than some of the more abstract things that rely on scientific consensus. And finally, involve local residents in input and decision-making. Make them feel heard, instruct, represent concerns, show genuine concern, etc. And so that's within all of these as well. But that's one of the causes of resentment, is just a feeling of a one-way street of, these are the findings, this is what you should do, and there's no sort of input back. You know, people on the ground or closer or with a different perspective might be able to add to the conversation. All right, and I just want to end this short talk also by thinking about, you know, I gave you a why are people anti-intellectual, but also just another way to be sort of empathetic to people who might feel this way, especially, you know, some of us might think, well, these people are just crazy. This is a sort of, think about this as stemming from legitimate concerns that people have. So not only maybe they feel disrespected or looked over, but also remember that skepticism and hesitancy with science is not always bad. The issue then comes in knowing when to be skeptical, when it's appropriate and when it's not. And that comes into play with scientific literacy. Another is that people who are anti-intellectual often have concerns over science and medicine being profit-driven or self-serving. And that can sometimes be true. If you think about, for instance, the opioid epidemic, that was because pharmaceutical companies were pushing doctors to prescribe something that was highly addictive and they knew it. And so that's an instance of, you know, being able to empathize. Maybe somebody has this tendency of anti-intellectualism. Okay, you can understand where they're coming from when they say, you know, I don't trust pharmaceutical companies, so I'm not going to get a COVID-19 vaccine or something like that. And then finally, a lot of times people who are anti-intellectual, it's an indication that they do have certain values, such as independence of thought, or you know, a feeling that certain people, like if they have a fancy advanced degree, they're not better than others. And so there's an element of egalitarianism, and that's another way to sort of try to empathize with where they're coming from, if you're dealing with these types of individuals. Finally, I want to put in a caveat. Just because someone tends towards anti-intellectualism doesn't necessarily mean they're anti-science. It just means they're more likely to distrust scientific consensus or scientific findings, especially if it's something that's newer, if it's a newer finding, if it's more abstract, or if it's a more drastic change. And they're also going to be more susceptible to campaigns that might promote skepticism. So they might be more susceptible to, for instance, the campaign by oil companies to promote climate change denialism, for example. All right, that's all I have for my presentation. I look forward to the discussion and any questions. This was just a quick overview. And there's some of my contact information, as well as a QR code to my website as well.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. There was already a question in the chat about whether your slides might be available afterwards. I'm not sure how you feel about that.
That is fine. I can send them to you maybe, and then you can.
Yeah, we can send it out to our list. That's great. So folks, if you have questions or comments, or maybe even like experiences in your own communities of kind of, you know, running into this and what do I do? Okay, I already see Edward with a hand up, and other folks feel free to either use your Zoom hand or your real hand. Edward, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. So for many years, I've reviewed proposed policies with the American Public Health Association. I'm a member and past chair of the ethics section. I have relentlessly, over many years, reviewed policies with the comment, there is no representative rural sample in your policy. You do not indicate that the recommendations would be implemented differently in a rural jurisdiction. In any case, the rural-urban divide is universally, from my experience, not recognized in policies coming to the American Public Health Association. It's unfathomable to me. There is great resistance to that. So I would claim that there's very strong scientific evidence and ethical evidence that the rural-urban divide needs to be taken into account. Therefore, I propose back that those people who don't take that into account are actually anti-intellectual. They do not properly and intelligently include rural sample studies. They don't do the research. When you say the extension universities used to exist, yes, they did. And apparently there's little or no interest in sampling, including rural samples and research. And so the recommendations come around to just imposing ideas that were created in places far distant from rural experiences and rural communities without engaging them. So it feels a lot to me, and I am definitely an intellectual. So I can identify an anti-intellectual rather easily. And my first education was at Swarthmore, no doubt. So I really can detect anti-intellectuals. So that is important to note. So a lot of the elite authorities are themselves anti-intellectual. So then that's a comment, you can comment back. Now I want other people to comment, but I want to add this. When we talk about anti-intellectualism and differences in how different communities frame the reality they live in and the way they see the world, I do believe that many rural people and others frame the world not with intellectual constructs or constructs. They frame the world with values. In particular, they may be religious values or they may be moral values. And rural people have a lot of moral values they live with daily. They care for land, they care for living things, they care for animals, they care about life and death. I have seen so many big, hairy rural men cry when they had to kill the baby calf, for example. So the moral element is really important to come to convince rural people. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, Edward, thank you for those really insightful comments on both sort of areas that you're talking about there. I agree with you on the first element, or the sort of sentiment of what you're saying with the first element, that experts themselves are not practicing science, even though they call themselves intellectuals and others anti-intellectuals, if they're excluding certain groups, the perspectives and knowledge of certain groups, 100%. I sort of skirted around it a little bit because I defined anti-intellectualism as a distrust of scientific experts and intellectuals. So in that way, they themselves would not be distrustful of themselves, but they would be, it's very insightful what you say, because you're saying, you're showing the bias in the opposite direction, where a lot of times we think about, well, what's wrong with these rural people being anti-intellectual? Well, what's wrong with these experts not taking other sorts of values and experiences into account? And I wholeheartedly agree. Political science especially is not great in incorporating urban-rural divisions, despite it being a very important thing. And then the second part, yes, I think that's also a good way to think about it. A lot of people in rural areas and elsewhere too, as intellectuals, we think about things almost exclusively scientifically, or a lot of times scientifically. And so we have a more narrow set of values in many ways. And other people have a broader set or a different set of values that they might incorporate into their decision making. And so another way to think about it is that they have a different value system, and thinking about how can we, try to help people using the language of their value system rather than just sort of imposing, well, this is what we found. And that's how it's going to be, type of thing. So yes, thank you for those comments.
Let's go to Sarah Lloyd.
Thanks so much for this really important and interesting research and reflection. I'm here in Wisconsin. My husband and I dairy farm here about an hour north of Madison, and I'm a rural sociologist by disciplinary training. And the book that became really famous in Wisconsin is The Politics of Resentment by Kathy Kramer, where she really looked at the rise of Scott Walker, who was the Republican governor, who then, went in and Wisconsin was kind of the laboratory for taking away collective bargaining rights for state union workers and nurses and all that, and a bunch of other bad stuff. Her assertion is, kind of a resource scarcity assertion that the resentment is coming from folks conceiving of a sort of zero-sum game, that like if some group of people gets something, then I will automatically lose something. And I'm wondering, I think your example of like extension and kind of having a top-down sort of come in, tell you what to do, and don't stick around to try to help people actually do it or deal with the consequences. I'm just wondering how sort of your research on the intellectual perceptions meshes or doesn't mesh with like the kind of zero-sum politics assertion in books like Kathy Kramer's.
Yeah, so Kathy Kramer's book I read right before I started my PhD, and it essentially drove me to start this line of research. So I'm very familiar with that one. And I'm glad you brought up the questions that you did. So one big one, especially with the zero-sum competition. Actually, I have another paper on this looking specifically at some of the dimensions she looks at in her, her interviews in Wisconsin. And I make the argument that it is more a symbolic or a more, identity or status-based thing than a zero-sum competition. In that when people sort of say, well, we don't get the resources we're supposed to, or the things we're supposed to, it's not necessarily that they're saying that literally, it's more they're saying they don't really care about what we want, type of thing. In my dissertation, I also find that at least cross-nationally, it might be different in Wisconsin, the upper Midwest has a different sort of legacy than elsewhere in the United States when it comes especially to issues of redistribution. But I find that it's not necessarily people's immediate, what's education status or income level that's driving some of these attitudes. It's concerns over their community and whether the community is sort of declining or not, economically speaking. And so I make that argument to say, well, this is more about a group-based thing. It's more about a group-based identity that people have of their local community, and they're concerned about, their social identity and their group falling behind rather than them personally. So that's the argument I make in that, and then I sort of extend that to say, well, it's more this symbolic or this more, identity-based thing. It is rooted in some economic concerns, but I think it's, I think those economic concerns might be driving some of it, but it's part of something a little bit broader, I guess. That's a great question.
Thanks. Barbara Harrison, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to share with people my experience. I live in Ithaca, New York, in the Finger Lakes. We're home to Cornell University. I've been working on healthcare, single payer, Medicare for all. And I had written a storytelling workshop and done a lot of research about, specifically geared to rural communities. And I agree with what Kristin my research has shown. The reluctance of no interest. And I also found this when I lived in Oregon. There are rural chapters there, but Lane County is surrounded by rural communities. And one payer states, another single payer group. There is a reluctance to want to cross the what I call ethnic, class, and cultural boundaries. They're not interested in that issue. And I just find it drives me crazy. It makes me very depressed, because you have an opportunity, if you're going to bring a new system, to work with people and make them part, I shouldn't say make, incorporate them into the conversation. And my storytelling workshop, I won't go into details, but to me, this is very critical. And there is such a reluctance to want to do this. And I recall when there was an election and people in Ithaca held something at the library, but there was nobody from the rural community there. And it was like, don't you think that you need to either go out into the community and have something in that community? Maybe people aren't able to get to Ithaca, and plus they're not comfortable coming. But the whole thing is just preposterous to me. So I just wanted to share that it's very disheartening that groups are left out because we're not interested in that issue, to quote somebody. So
yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's widespread. It's what Edward was saying as well. There's this we see it. There are rural communities actually being forgotten because people don't care or don't think that it's really that big of a difference culturally, or they think, well, we'll just get a majority and push what we want, which is going to just worsen the problem, right? So yeah, I empathize. I understand. That's too bad. It really is.
It is. And the politicians do it too. They'll play on people's emotions, and then there's nothing. You want to make change, be inclusive, listen. That's the first thing. Listen to people's experiences. And that's why I'm a big person for storytelling. It presents a level playing field to have a conversation. It's not a presentation.
Yeah, I like that element of storytelling as well. That's, it's a different way to give information that might be.
Thank you, Kristin.
I'm going to ask the question in a second, but I also just wanted to say I posted in chat a survey. If folks haven't taken it, we're trying to identify what are the best, most convenient times for people for our future monthly briefings. So afterwards, if you want to click on that and take the survey, that would really be helpful. So what I wanted to ask is, like, in your studies, have you encountered any kind of interventions of like groups or universities or individuals who have tried to go about things in a different way and had like any kind of measurably different outcomes in rural communities?
Yeah, so I mean, I gave a few examples in there in the presentation, but another example, and I don't, this example doesn't give a lot of like outcome measurement, but I was part of a project a few years ago, and it was based in Minneapolis and partnered with the University of Minnesota, and they're called the Rural Energy Dialogues. So what the nonprofit would do is they'd pick different places in rural Minnesota that were looking to invest in either wind energy or solar energy, because it brings jobs. As the argument I said before, it brings jobs. People are interested in being self-sufficient in terms of energy, and they would organize these community sort of forums. There would be 1 to 2 days, and then if they were the local residents were actively involved, they would even get compensation for work that they might have missed. And they went through and talked about their concerns, and then we made sort of like a report after the end of the day, and we sent it out to the community, and that tries to help along decision making on these types of issues and input and feedback and things like that. And I think it helps open open the discussion a little more to make people more receptive to that type of information. But those sorts of things, I think, essentially anything that goes into community and tries to be empathetic or listen, I think is something that would be effective in some regard. Yeah, things like that. There's my cat.
I'm, I'm wondering if something like are you familiar with Jim Fishkin at Stanford and his deliberative democracy?
That's what this was. It was
Oh, it
specifically
was.
deliberative
Okay.
democracy. Yes, it's the Rural Energy Dialogues. If you look online, they have like a whole website. It's a good way to, they
Rural
can,
Energy
it could potentially
Dialogues.
be,
Okay.
moved to other places, that sort of way in which that style of deliberation, and also on different topics too.
Mm-hmm.
I can move that in.
Yeah, that's great. Because I do wonder if people like have an opportunity, like, to be in a setting where they can, maybe there's an expert making a presentation and people might be skeptical, but if they have the opportunity to like ask questions and have their questions treated respectfully, not like stupid questions, and, have the researcher answer what they can and be honest and say where they can't, like, I don't know, is something maybe experts are reluctant to say. I wonder if that would be a better outcome if people were just, felt more respected in the moment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Okay, looks like we're gonna circle back to Edward, and then Barbara, I see you'll be next.
Thank you. So I was able to, through the Medical Reserve Corps in our rural health district here in Southside Virginia, was able to help put on the early and continuing COVID vaccination clinics. So one of the key words that mysteriously the experts left out of the published literature was the word free, F-R-E-E.
Yes.
I was astonished, because I can't tell you how many people waiting in line, and early on, as many people experience, we had big lines in rural areas, the older folks and their caregivers. Then it dwindled, but many people would say, where do I pay? What do I have to pay? So that's just a disconnect of a simple thing. They should have known to highlight the word free, because lots of rural people ain't got no health insurance, or they're out of pocket, they have high deductibles, and a simple thing like that, astonishing to me. It was apparently no one even thought to ask 3 rural people, why would you come, or what would keep you from coming, and that many of them would have said, I can't pay for that.
Right.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing too. I mean, that's another dimension, is just messaging on some of this stuff, and just, whoever's making these things, academics or whoever, just not really understanding how regular people think. And I don't just mean rural, I mean like anyone not an academic, right? Because it's not just rural people who need to know that. It's a lot of people, they see free, oh, it's easy, or they didn't know, oh, you can just go, to the local pharmacy and get the vaccine or something like that. That doesn't get into other issues of, if you're looking at the vaccine, issues of access, just geographic distance, it can be harder. There are other sorts of rural specific concerns that might be preventing people from getting these. Absolutely. Yeah. There was also a question here in the chat a while ago from Sarah that I wanted to answer quick before
Yeah, sure.
get some of the others, if that's okay. So I heard a story when vaccines were first available about going to churches to present information sessions, other ideas for reaching rural folks who see education and science as ungodly or unchristian. I mean, for the people who are going to see science or parts of science as ungodly or unchristian, I mean, that's the big place where that's the big opportunity where you can try to change their minds, is if you get, especially their local church or people within their local church to represent the vaccines positively, or whatever you're talking about positively. I think that's a huge step. The small town I grew up in had quite a few evangelical churches, and they're the hub of the community a lot of times in smaller towns. So it's not just the people who are very strongly Christian, but just generally the people in the community. A lot of times that's a place where you sort of congregate, or can meet a lot of people at once. So, yeah, I guess I don't have other things to add to that other than, just other members of the community that they might know. But that's a big one. I think that's a good idea.
Okay, back to you, Barbara, and then Anthony.
Kristin, what is the role of the public schools in rural area? I've done one-on-one teaching with students that were either expelled, suspended, had physical or emotional issues, or were awaiting placement, but it's not the same as the general, of the system. So what is their role? And is there anything in terms of, say, science or other kinds of information that can come through the public schools, that if the teachers and the principals in the schools, because the school is located in a rural area, especially elementary schools, and that's I'm thinking about here, that they would have relationship with the parents. So I'll let you answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, schools, that they provide an opportunity, but they're also a challenge in that a lot of them are underfunded to have some sorts of like programs to try to increase outreach. A lot of times they're understaffed, and a lot of times the people who might be working within the school system, the local school system, might be, the people who are against vaccines, or who think that, the ones that are skeptical of certain elements of science. So that provides its own sort of barrier a lot of times. But I think, public schools can give a lot of opportunities in terms of ways to talk about some of these things, or provide outreach, not just to students, but also the broader, parents or the broader community. They can be, again, hubs for giving information, or, to having a vaccine clinic, or whatever else we're talking about. That can be helpful as well. So yeah, I think that's a mixed bag. It depends on sort of how things are set up, and it depends on how much resources and time people have. But that is one way, alongside, of course, public schools being able to teach science literacy, which I didn't mention as a potential, but it's important as a potential way to deal with this. But it's important, for younger people, especially, to learn scientific literacy.
Well, there's also media literacy. There's media literacy. Ithaca College has a minor in that Look Sharp program, where teachers can get any information, and it teaches you how to read, into visual, and so on. It gives you thinking skills, which we don't always do anymore with teach to the test. So, the science literacy would definitely be part of the overall literacy, media literacy approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great point too. The media literacy is part of the science literacy at this point, in trying to navigate the current information environment, because it's changed so much.
Okay, I think our last question will be from Anthony.
Thanks, Erica. Sorry, we're having a thunderstorm and I just dropped off the face of the planet for about 7 or 8 minutes, but great presentation, Kristin. I've, Kathy Kramer's book also talked a lot about part of the foundation of the resentment or the suspicion was also that sense that their own knowledge and expertise of local people was rarely acknowledged by the expert class, whether they were farmers or foresters or fishermen or loggers or whatever. And that's really been my experience in Appalachia, is a lot of that. So I was going to ask you to comment on this. So besides the leading with morals and values, I think the other thing is that intellectuals generally, including scientific experts, tend to speak in abstractions. And most people, and certainly most country people, speak in concrete and really don't relate to and are almost automatically skeptical of abstractions. So I think that's a really important piece. So like for years, I ran an organization that worked on a variety of different elements of sustainability, and we were helping tobacco farmers. We were a very conservative lot, transition to something other than tobacco, particularly things like organic produce and free range poultry and blah, blah, blah. And in that process, we did a lot of kind of farmer to farmer learning. We set up and hosted tours of one another's farms. Mine was one of them, but there was many others that were these old-fashioned, old-time conservative tobacco farmers who were now experimenting with different crops, produce, other things, and different techniques, regenerative. And what we found was that when those farmers started to get a sense that what they were doing on their place was worth sharing with other people, that they were experts, that they also became a whole lot more open to the folks from the land grants, from UT or Virginia Tech. It was no longer as much of a us and them or the outsider group thing about them, because we brought those experts in, and they did have expertise to contribute, but we brought them into a process where it was more kind of community-based and peer learning. And I wonder if you have heard of other efforts like that. It's kind of easier to do around farming because of the nature of it. It would be a little harder to do that maybe around climate change or something, but I wonder if you've learned of or heard of other efforts to really put the expertise, the expert hat on local people, and then bring in the experts from outside after you've established the local expertise.
Yeah, so the first element you talked about was that concrete versus abstraction. And I think that's a really important point as well. Because in my presentation, I tried to make it a point of saying that just because you're anti-intellectual and distrustful of experts doesn't mean you're always anti-science. It tends to be they're more distrustful of the scientific consensus if it's something more abstract or something sort of like outside of their realm of knowledge. And I think that points to that it's just, certain people are used to thinking about things a certain way and understanding the world a certain way. And so that's a great point. And I think sort of leading into what you were saying too about, going around and farmers showing each other. I think that's a good idea because it shows that concrete part, but it also, as you say, gets rid of that feeling of a hierarchy, like, one's better than another. Well, no, we're just going to exchange ideas. And that makes people feel, more included and less of an us versus them, as you say. In terms of, have I heard stuff like that? I haven't, other than farmers talking about like, what seed they're going to plant or something like that. But I think that's something that could have a lot of great applications. Most definitely. I really like that program. What was the name of it?
It was called Appalachian Harvest. It's actually still going on. I'm not involved with it anymore, but it was part of a market-driven initiative to aggregate product and get into much larger markets. And as a spin-off of that, the farmers that were growing and selling for the markets we established, then kind of somewhat naturally, with a little bit of nudging on our part, became also this peer learning network.
That's really cool. I really like that. I'm going to look into that more because I think that's a great idea.